So thank you very much for sticking it out. It's been a great conference, really happy to be here. And I am a forage agronomist. So I just want to give you a little bit of my personal perspective on this and professional perspective on this. But before I do that, I need to give the standard disclaimer that I'm going to give you opinions, observations based on my understanding of relevant science. They should not necessarily be considered the policy of Barenbrug USA, Barenbrug Holding, or the other worldwide Barenbrug companies. Nor am I a professional physician. I'm not a medical doctor. I'm not that kind of doctor. And I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. Nor am I an RD. But fortunately, we have an RD here. So don't consider anything that I say health advice or dietary advice. That can get you in trouble in places, and we don't want to get in trouble, right? But I am happy to help you find sources. There'll be some references listed on graphics, and I'll be happy to get those to you if you'd like to contact me. So none of us comes here as a blank page, do we? We all bring information, experience, attitudes, beliefs to the table, literally and figuratively. So I'd like to just kind of start with a few things and ask a few questions. And Adele hit on this, but let's just start with which mammals are designed to digest a low-fat diet. So we got Group A. Group A is made up of sheep and cattle and mountain gorilla, which we just heard about. And Group B is made up of modern humans, lions, and polar bears. So how many people think that Group A is the group of mammals that's designed to digest a low-fat diet? Okay. And how many people think that Group B is the one that's designed to digest a low-fat diet? And how many people are suspecting strongly a trick question? Because it is a trick question. Neither of them is designed to digest a low-fat diet. There's a difference between ingest and digest. And such are the things that we really have to pay attention to. Those seemingly unimportant differences are really important. So with sheep and with cattle, we have pregastric fermentation. So for the ruminant scientists in the room, what are the two principal products of rumen fermentation?
Short-chain fatty acids.
Yes? Microbial protein. Right? So a cow eating grass might be eating a diet, well, probably eating a diet less than 5% ether extract. By the time we get done with microbial protein and the volatile fatty acids that are absorbed through the rumen, she gets about 60% of her energy from fat. Isn't that remarkable? Low fat in, she gets high fat, and what's remarkable is that that's a fairly consistent number across many, many different kinds of mammals, but the apparatus varies tremendously. Okay? So, with all due respect to Mr. Pollen, you are not what you eat, you are what your body does with what you eat. For anyone who has trouble with that concept, here's a review. This is high fiber, low fat, low in protein. This is not. Right? So these cows have taken this feed stuff and through pregastric fermentation have then created this wonderful resource for us to utilize. Or put it another way, right? That's a pretty good trick. I'd much rather have heavy whipping cream than grass. Thank you very much. Oh, I do come from Oregon. I mean the pasture. Okay, I mean the foot. Never mind, sorry. Do you think if we put a basset on a treadmill, we can turn it into a greyhound? People in livestock know that genetics is going to influence potential. But it's only potential. Right? We know about that stuff. Unfortunately, many other people don't know that. Including the people that tell us that in order to be lean, we need to exercise a lot. Right? So you might become a lean basset, but you're going to be a basset. And there's a difference between as lean as you can be and as lean as you'd like to be. And that's a whole nother conversation. I have heard people say that they got into genealogy so they could figure out who to blame. So biology isn't fair. Is all processed food created equal? Really? I hope to stop here on my way home tomorrow. This is a German deli in Portland, Oregon, called Edelweiss. One of their marvelous creations is this wonderful little thing called stuffed bacon. Schweinebauch. Start with a side of bacon. Need you do anything more. Stuff it with their house-made bologna. Bake it and slice it. Yes, please. That's the equivalent of tofu in terms of processing. I mean, the fact is, all our food is processed in one way or another. And certainly none of us go out in the pasture and start macking on the cow with a knife and fork. Adele, the last time we were together, used a phrase that Americans love the idea of saving the world by shopping. Right? And we're doing that. And I would suggest that that leads to some really strange behavior. Okay? And by the end of this talk, you're going to understand just how strange this is. But let's just assume, and it's argument, I'm not promoting it one way or another, but let's say that there's something inherently dangerous about sugar. Don't matter, table, beet, sugar cane, I don't care. Sugar, something bad about sugar. Is having organic sugar really going to make it better? What's the implication, though, of tagging organic in front of it? And then it gets really weird. Carbon-free sugar. Have they reinvented chemistry? Am I missing something here? How do you make C12H22O11 without those, 12 little C's? So we heard before about the whole food pyramid idea, which of course has been replaced, but this idea of what our ranking of foodstuff should be, and frankly it is easier to fool people than to convince them they've been fooled. And if you're not careful about how you try to show them where the error is, the error gets amplified and gets a bigger imprint in their mind just by talking about it. Regardless of what you say about it, it's something about human behavior. As Adele said, the purpose of these guidelines, as Dr. Eads has said, we've all been unwitting subjects in a long observational study. The hypothesis of which is that a low-fat, high-carb diet, that's two different ways to say the same thing. If you say low-fat, you're saying high-carb. If you say high-fat, you're saying low-carb, essentially. So you can change those. Will reduce obesity, diabetes, and the other so-called diseases of civilization. In my view, it hasn't worked out all that well. Or as someone else said, can we get the low-fat proponents to apologize? Because it hasn't worked out all that well, as Adele has laid out. Now, this is my personal experience. Okay, this was me, Christmas 2007. One of those deals where you put the camera on the tripod, and you get it all composed, and you hope the dogs are going to behave, and you hit the shutter release timer, and you run and you get in the picture, and then you look at the picture, because we now have digital cameras, you can see it immediately, and you start wondering what's wrong with your camera, right? Because clearly I don't look that way. But I did, right? It wasn't the camera's fault. One trick for people preparing presentations, if you stretch your picture vertically by 10% but leave the horizontal the same, you'll look much better. And that actually is a presentation trick I got from somebody. It's, really? Like they're not going to look at you and the slide and go, there's something different here. So this is me 3 years later. And the difference is that in 2000, that moment of clarity for me, I was a 51-year-old, obese, balding, pre-diabetic. My wife, Nancy, had been on her own journey and had been adopting the pattern. She'd been reading and studying and trying to figure out what to do. She was a smart enough woman to know that talking to me about it before I was ready to listen to her talk to me about it probably would not be helpful. And so when this was the thing that tipped me, and I then said, well, what could you give me to read? And then 3 years later, this is what I look like when I'm balding. Sorry. It's not magic, right? But yeah, I did reverse the prediabetes. I was no longer obese, okay? And if you know people who have ever tried dieting to lose weight, it was a completely different experience than I had had before. Okay? So that got me reading a bunch of stuff, and that, again, got me thinking outside of many boxes. And the problem with thinking outside the box is as soon as you break out of one, you realize you're in another one. But it's okay, just bring some of what you had in the previous box with you. Don't be a box jumper, where you leave everything behind and now you jump into a new box and paradigm. There's no learning there. And too often I see that going on. So there's lots of things to look at. I become concerned about some things, but maybe we'll get into that a little bit. So what are the products of forage agriculture? As a forage agronomist, it's ruminant agriculture. It's butter, it's cheese, it's meat, right? And all of those we've been told to eat less of. So join me on this journey, and we're going to have to kill some sacred cows, ours as well as others, if we're going to do this with any integrity. Right? Because I talked about the boxes. We have to be prepared to look at our own as we go out and we start, trying to talk to anybody else. But don't worry, they make nice burgers. So, and I hope to be of honest service today. As Charles Darwin said, to kill an error is as good a service as, and sometimes even better than, the establishment of a new fact. Or, if an honest man is wrong, after demonstrating he is wrong, he is either stops being wrong or he stops being honest. So here we go, okay? And I hope I can do that, and I hope I remain open to the process. The key takeaways I want you to take away from this session, especially if you're involved in ruminant agriculture, in selling your product into the marketplace. Meat is both animal protein and animal fat, as well as many other nutrients. I'm going to focus on the fat and the protein, okay? Animal fat is not a health hazard. Animal protein is superior to plant protein. Ruminant agriculture occupies a unique ecological niche. We have to have it. I want to talk about what I see as the unsustainable prices, which may be a little different than what frequently gets talked about. And I want to talk about what I call Green Revolution version 2. So let's launch into this. As was mentioned, and this quote, that for a generation research on heart disease has been more political than scientific, but please note the date. 1978, so that means that for at least 2 generations it's been more political than scientific. Okay, and you'll never see the heart check logo on that product. Why? You know that that's a product placement thing that the manufacturers pay. That's a revenue stream to the American Heart Association. They pay the Heart Association to put that logo on Cocoa Puffs. And so they have a vested interest in not re-examining what it is that goes into the heart check, Okay, sorry. Moving on. It's now acknowledged that neither dietary nor serum cholesterol represent a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Anybody here watch TV? Anybody here see statin drug ads? Serum cholesterol is the cholesterol in your blood. $24 billion a year of statin drug sales. Remember, I'm not a physician. Don't take anything I say as medical advice. But this is the acknowledgement from people doing the work. Saturated fat does not cause heart disease. People who eat less fat, particularly less saturated fat, appear not to extend their lives by doing so. Well, then why wouldn't you? I mean, why are we doing that? And then there's this, that we have known for a very long time that if you swap saturated fat with polyunsaturated fat, bad things happen. And I like the first quote, was it not possible that a diet high in unsaturated fat might have noxious effects when consumed over a period of many years? Such diets are, after all, rarities. And then you can see the things that have been seen in studies looking at polyunsaturated and unsaturated fats replacing saturated fat to drive down cholesterol, which we now understand is not a risk factor for cardiovascular disease. Moving along, you'll hear a phrase, nutrient-rich. It's defined and explicitly in the definition is low in fat because they don't consider fat a nutrient. That's interesting. So I understand marketing, I understand the marketplace a little bit, I think. The beef industry has certainly tried to adopt the idea of we can be lean too. We belong in a healthy diet. 29 lean cuts of beef. We can meet those goals. They train people to go out and tell people how they can take their 90-10 ground beef, brown it, drain it, put it in the colander, pour boiling water over it to get even more of that fat out to make it even healthier. That's the beef industry people doing this. And we really, and what we've gotten for that is a dietary goals advisory process that was fully prepared to say, I don't care what kind of meat it is, it doesn't belong in a healthy diet. So don't fool yourself that this is about management or anything else. This is an animal products versus plant products issue. The concept that all proteins are of comparable nutritional value is flawed and should be rejected by anyone interested in planning healthful diets. This was known right up until we ran into that really unfortunate thing where we had to say it must be the animal products that are causing all the disease. Now we have to get this to work. And so we just sort of stopped talking about it. Or we had people like Diet for a Small Planet saying, well, if you take some of this and some of that and some of this and you eat it all together at the same meal every time, you'll be fine. The fact that there really wasn't much work to support that, never let the facts get in the way of a good story. So let's explore this just a little bit. You saw a little bit of this in Adele's presentation. Let's start with similar amounts of meat and cooked navy beans. Okay, there's actually a little bit more crude protein in the same weight of cooked navy beans. But understand, crude protein is the total nitrogen times 6.25. That's how they determine crude protein. So it could be any kind of nitrogenous material in the foodstuff that then gets assumed to be crude protein. Now, just because you eat it doesn't mean it gets digested. There's a vast difference in the digestibility between, in this case, cooked navy beans and cooked beef steak. And so now we see that we've got more digestible protein in the beef, but then there's a thing called biological value, and there's a much greater biological value to the beef than to the beans, and we're just following multiplication across, easy for me to say. And so now we have 14 grams of usable protein out of that 100 grams of beef compared to 5.3, almost 3 times the usable protein in equivalent amounts.
Just out of curiosity, is the lower digestibility of the beans related to how much fiber is in the beans?
Could be fiber, could also be the nature of the nitrogenous compound. Again, all we're going to look at is the nitrogen that comes out in the feces. So it could be any number of things to indicate lower digestibility.
Just had a quick question, and maybe you can get to it later too, but in all of these studies and all the talk, is there ever the distinction between grass-fed and cattle?
We can talk about that later, but there would be no distinction in this in terms of crude protein, in terms of protein digestibility and biological value. And I think I'll show a slide that points to some of that here in a second. But we used to talk about something called complete protein. This was protein that provided all the amino acids in the proper ratio that human beings needed, and of course navy beans don't have it, and beef does. And yet our dietary suggestions recommendations all treat protein, plant, protein, animal as if they're equivalent. And then there's another problem. They talk about protein in terms of percent of calories, which is a completely incorrect way to talk about protein for human nutrition. There is an explicit amount of protein that each individual needs, and we need to figure that out for ourselves. This is one where they used a gram per kilogram of body weight as their goal. I don't know, I've seen 0.8, various figures. But in this case, if you're eating 10% of your calories as protein on a 1,000 calorie a day diet, you'd only be getting 25 grams of protein, when in fact what you need is 75 in this situation. And so now we talk about women who tend to be more healthy adherers than men, who probably have higher protein requirements than men on a normalized body weight basis, and they tend to eat less red meat than men because they're healthy adherers, and then they're on chronically calorically restricted diets, and so they're nowhere near meeting their needs. This was a slide from Dr. Slavin in January this year, and this is the point that it says, since nutrition research does not support that vegetarian diets, the second point here, are healthier than animal-based diets, there is a movement to sustainability as the reason to support plant-based diets. This is shifting the goalposts again. Okay? The story originally was it would be healthier. Oops, our bad. Okay. Sustainability now becomes the mantra that makes everything okay. So, with that in mind, forgive me, I'm just going to talk about a few issues because sustainability has to be multifactorial. It can't just be environmental. There needs to be an ecological component, there needs to be an environmental, economic component, there needs to be a societal component. As was said in this room yesterday, there's no sustainability without profit, right? So those sorts of things all have to be taken into account. And, you know, let's face it, grasslands are our most important ecological biome. For a number of reasons, not the least of which is they occupy a large portion of the Earth's land surface. And frankly, it's land that should never go into crops. But even a significant portion, 70% of the world's cropland areas are identified as being part of that grassland biome. They've been converted. Think of Iowa. Okay. So this was for Ray, who isn't here, I don't think, but we've heard a lot about soil health. There is nothing better for soil health than perennial grass cover. This was a demonstration where you have 4 different sods and you have water being sprayed on the top. And in the time it took to gather this gallon jug of sediment-laden water from clean till, overgrazed, or this 1/3 jug from cover crop sod, there's no water running off from the pasture. Or this is another one. This was from Nebraska. She's just dropped a clod into this water column. This is called a Slate Test. And you can see that we're starting to get some smaller clods dropping off. But you can see what's happening over here. She had just done this, and you see this shower of silt coming down. Okay, this is 20 minutes later. That clod is still intact. The water level's up there. Here's some. The water is clean, clear. It's almost completely broken down on this side, and here's all the silt, fine, no structure left, and it's silt-laden water. The difference here, it's the same soil type, it's the same map unit, there's a fence, there's continuous corn on the one side, and there was long-term pasture on the other side. So if we want to talk about sustainability, ruminant livestock, soil health, okay, we've heard a lot about that. Carbon cycling, let me just say this. Cellulose is the most abundant carbohydrate in the biosphere. We're talking about harvesting sunlight and fixing carbon dioxide to make carbohydrate. The vast majority of that is cellulose. The recycling of that fixed carbon is dependent on various microorganisms because mammals don't produce cellulase. And so those microorganisms, whether they live in a termite or in a ruminant or free living in the soil, are what break down cellulose and release CO2. And without their activity, if photosynthesis continued unabated, plant growth would stagnate due to a lack of CO2 in about 20 years. So it's critical to the functioning of the biosphere. And you may or may not be aware of the difference between starch and cellulose. It's just alpha versus beta linkage between glucose units. And you get either a tubular in the case of starch or a planar molecule. We can't digest this. We can digest that. And ruminants are what we're talking about doing the job. There's about 150 species of ruminants. The ones listed, mostly there have been managed by mankind to one degree or another, various times and places. Approximately a third of the global meat supply comes from ruminants. So if we're going to get rid of ruminants, what are we going to do? Work, fiber, milk, meat, hides, specialized anatomy, pre-gastric fermentation, talked about that. So again, they ingest a low-fat diet, high-fiber feedstuffs, poor quality protein. They digest a high-fat diet with high-quality protein. This is a little understood piece here. Plants have defense mechanisms too. They don't have teeth or claws. They can't get up and run away. So they make various compounds that are designed to make their consumers ill. And there's a long list of these substances. And if they were to be isolated and administered to test animals, they would be found to be carcinogenic in large case, certainly bad for the health. And what the ruminant is able to do with those is essentially detoxify that food stream. Those products don't end up in milk or meat. You will hear all kinds of numbers about the efficiency of livestock and why we should eat the food directly. Here's one that's interesting that came from the Council for Agricultural Science and Technology. And, 2.6 pounds of feed grain to human food for beef animals. 2.6 pounds to 1 pound. So I hear 10 to 1, I hear all kinds of numbers. This is a set of data that you could go, happy to share it with you. Dairy, of course, is very efficient. And sheep also. This is looking at developed versus developing world. So there are differences there, but it's nowhere near the commonly cited figures. And then this is what's really exciting when we think about providing protein to the world's population. Ratio of human edible protein input to the human edible protein output, U.S. systems for dairy, beef, pigs, and poultry. So beef cow or a dairy cow will produce far more utilizable protein for us for the amount of human utilizable. It's manufacturing protein. It's not representing that 10 to 1 kind of story that we've heard. So this now gets us into what I think is the truly unsustainable prices. If we really want to have an honest conversation about sustainability from a societal point of view, in North Carolina today, almost 2/3 of your adults are either obese or overweight. So almost 64%. You rank 9th in terms of incidence of diabetes in your adults, and these are 2011 figures. It's undoubtedly worse. Your kids, almost 28%, 28, 29%. Of them are either overweight or obese, high schoolers, and 33%, and this is actually a 2007 number for the all children 10 to 17 years. This is a coming issue. But numbers are hard for me to visualize sometimes, so I just want to try this for you. And also work through some of the numbers and some of the issues with how we've been giving these estimates. There are about 242 million adults or Americans 18 years or older. Per the CDC, 35% of those are obese, which by their definition meant that they had a BMI of 30 or greater. Okay? Well, how good is BMI as an indicator of health? Well, CDC itself says you really shouldn't use it, even as an indicator of body fatness or as a diagnostic of body fatness or health of an individual. It's meant for screening purposes. Okay, maybe there's something better. People have looked at something called Metabolic Syndrome, and per CDC, 34% of adult Americans have Metabolic Syndrome. Metabolic Syndrome is defined as having 3 out of these 5 symptoms: abdominal obesity, elevated serum triglycerides, depressed HDL cholesterol, elevated blood pressure, elevated fasting glucose, blood glucose. Okay? You have 3 out of those 5, you qualify per this authority as having metabolic syndrome. What happens if you only have 2? What happens if you have 1? How accurate are those risk factors at tying to disease? Well, earlier in September, this paper was published in JAMA, and what they reported was 14% of adult Americans are diabetic, 38% of them have prediabetes. That means that 52% of adult Americans are either diabetic or pre-diabetic. Well, how did they make that diagnosis? Well, diabetes, if you had a diagnosis of diabetes, click, or if you had hemoglobin A1C that was greater than 6.5, or you had fasting blood glucose over 126, or if you, in some cases, they had a 2-hour glucose tolerance test result. When you satisfied those, they considered you diabetic. Then there were a series of above normal but below diabetic. That's how they defined prediabetes. And my question again is, how accurate are these? Or are we still looking at some marker that isn't really doing a good job of assessing the disease? Back in the 70s, there was a pathologist who did a number of oral glucose tolerance tests coupled with insulin assays. Now, part of the reason that this policy thing matters is because what he was looking at directly contradicted what the developing policy was going to be. And we can't have that. And so this work has been forgotten until relatively recently, although Joseph Kraft published this in a number of journals. He recently published a book with an intriguing title. Should everyone be tested? Absolutely not. Only those concerned about their future. He's 95 years old. There's recently a YouTube video interview. You can see him. But this is what he found. Of the 14,000 some patients that he administered that coupled test to, 75% of the patients who would have passed based on the results of an oral glucose tolerance test. In other words, this rarely used or lesser used gold standard for diagnosing diabetes, 75% false negative. 75% of the time, your doctor would say, you're fine, you don't have to worry about it. When in fact, what they found was they were hyperinsulinemic to some point. They had some version of elevated insulin. And there's a lot of interesting work looking at insulin levels and their tie to chronic illness. What he found were these characteristic patterns of insulin response as part of this oral glucose tolerance test, where the blue one is a normal line, and then all these 3 represent some kind of elevated or delayed response to insulin. They're seeing this a decade or more before the blood glucose goes wrong. Ophthalmologists are seeing damage to the retina a decade before the blood sugar goes. Specific pathological damage to kidneys before the sugar goes. So again, what are we looking at? How does policy impact what we're actually looking for? And so here we go. Let's go back to this. I showed this where 52% of the population now is either diabetic or pre-diabetic. Let's take that, what would that be? 86% of the population that's not diabetic, apply that 75% figure to it, and now we're looking at something that looks potentially, I'm making an argument, I'm not saying I got the data to back this up, but I've laid it out for you. We're talking about a huge percentage of the adult population in the United States who is on some spectra of the diabetes, insulin dysregulation phenomenon. Okay? And what we do know is that the right diet is the best prescription for people with diabetes or metabolic syndrome. And this is just one study. Feynman, Volek, and Westman draw your attention to this 50% reduction in insulin. Right? We were just talking about hyperinsulinemia. And this diet is one that's restricted in carbohydrates, and the light blue color is the low-fat diet that's recommended to us by our official government policy and public health educators to reduce our incidence of chronic disease. if I'm anywhere close to being right with estimates, nothing else matters. Because we can't know anything else until we've accounted for this. This is the biggest noise in the system. And so anybody who wants to talk to me about the tie between various components and some chronic illness that doesn't account for the fact that we're dealing with at least 50% and perhaps as much as 80% of the adult population being diabetic, pre-diabetic, hyperinsulinemic, sorry, I don't think we have that kind of confidence. So the problem with all this is there's all kinds of belief systems involved and political philosophies involved and agendas involved. But at the end of the day, we're talking about human beings. And you can tell when idols are being worshipped because human beings are being sacrificed. The children of this mother are going to be impacted by their environment in utero. And there's suggestion that, in fact, her children will be impacted by what happened to her in utero. We are facing a huge economic cost from a failing healthcare system that's struggling to deal with the burden of diabetes. Those of us who are in the livestock industry, while we've been blamed for that, ironically, are in a position to provide the product that's the best prescription for people that are in that condition. So is there anything more pitiful than a life lost in the service of some unfound belief? I dream of the day when the public understands that their consumption of the products in the background lessens their need for the products in the foreground. And that day is coming. Many of your customers are going to be these kinds of people. Okay, but you also, if you're at farmers markets or you're interacting with the public, you have a chance to say, no, animal products belong in a healthy diet. And there are many sources of information that summarize some of the things that Adele mentioned earlier, things that I've just mentioned, and we're happy to help get that information out there. Because the industry can no longer say, oh, we fit too, we belong, because at the end of the day, that's just not what that debate is about. That debate is about you shouldn't be doing what you're doing. You shouldn't own animals. You shouldn't control animals. You shouldn't kill animals. You shouldn't eat animals. And so then the last thing that I would offer to anyone who's in research, anyone who's been doing work where they're trying to pursue funds for efforts relating to forage agriculture, what would happen if the policy got switched and so ruminant products were no longer seen as a health hazard? What if those products were seen to be a necessary component for human health and well-being? In fact, it's arguable that they could be foundational for prosperity. The assumption now is that as people become more prosperous, they eat more animal products. But the argument can be made that no, in fact, you've got that backwards because people who can't afford animal products get animal products. They'll completely ruin the wildlife to do it, but they're going to get it. So, with that, I've probably gone just about 10 minutes longer than I planned to, so that may or may not be a bad thing. Pretty much what we planned on, wasn't it? So this is some contact information for myself, how you can reach me. I'm known on the web, so feel free to contact me. I'm happy to help any way I can, and I'm very happy to be working for a company that supports me in doing that. So if you're looking for forage seed soft sale, I'll say call Kate Haas. He'll be happy to hook you up. So if there's questions at this point, I think now is the time for me to just shut up and listen. So thank you.